Hello everyone, I'm Mario and welcome back. In this video we're going to talk about subdivision and answer questions on how do we know when to add more edges, or how do we know when to apply subdivision to our models. So here I have a very simple example, because in principle this is relatively kind of like a simple concept. So before we answer the question, so how do we know when to add more topology or when to subdivide the model, it really depends on its purpose and what kind of shapes are we trying to get out of it. So just to quickly demonstrate what a subdivision is so that we are kind of like on the same page, here we're going to have, let's say, two objects, and one is going to be sort of like our original, and the second one is going to be our smooth preview. And smooth preview is usually the one where you're going to just preview your object, see how it looks on the subdivision. And then that again simply means that if you go here on the subdivision levels for our object, we can toggle this option right here where it says display subdivisions. And then we can see that as we add more and more subdivisions, the object is getting smoother and smoother, but it's also getting sort of like more heavier in topology, where you can see here that what we have as a one polygon here, that one polygon turned into four the moment where this object is becoming kind of like smoother and smoother. So one turns to 4, and then 4 turns to 16, 32, and so on. So this is basically how our subdivision is going to work. We're going to leave it for now, and we're going to turn display subdivision off. And let's turn this off as well, and let's go out from the preview mode. So like I mentioned, this is still a preview mode, and we still have only this as our geometry. So let's leave it as like this in a preview mode. All right, so now the question is, do we want to preserve the corner as is from our geometry, or do we want to have a curvature from this object right here? So this is always going to be the question, what do we actually want to create here? Because if we need to create a corner, in that case what we will do, we'll select our object, go to any kind of cut tool, and simply start adding geometry. And the rule here is you want to keep your geometry balanced and evenly optimized. So if we add edges on one end, we simply need to apply the same rule on the other end as well, until the geometry is balanced, so until we get something like this. And now we can notice also that the more topology we add, or more edges we add, we also get sort of like that edges back, so that kind of like sharpness. And again, the more edges you add around this corner, the more of a sharper corner we get. So we slowly kind of like getting the original shape back. There's only going to be one difference, is that our object is going to have more of a highlight, which is the ultimate goal, what we're trying to get, this highlight, so that it looks really nice in render. So this is kind of like one way. The other way how subdivision works is going to be that we actually apply this, what we see here, so that we keep the curvature, but that we at the same time also get this right here, this number, as a working geometry, because right now this is not a working geometry, same as it is here. So that's kind of like the ultimate goal. So the way to achieve this is we're going to use another operation. Instead of a multi-cut, we're going to go here to use a smooth operation. So instead, let's just go here to this little checkbox and just make sure that you reset the settings to make sure again that we're just working on the same settings. And once we have that, simply we're going to go and smooth it out. And then we're going to have this one subdivision level, and here we can decide on how many subdivisions we want to go, or simply hit G to repeat the operation. And there we go. So now we have that curvature with the same amount of topology that we can actually progress further and further into detail. So this is now a sub question on how do we know when to add more and more topology. How do we know when to add more topology than this, or more edges than this? So for example, if this right here is the extent of the object that we're trying to use, this is going to be just enough topology. So we do not plan to add any kind of detailing, any kind of openings. And for the sake of it, just to hold the curvature, this is going to be more than enough. On the other hand, if we're planning to do, let's say, more of a detailing, and if we want to have some kind of like opening in the middle, the current topology is not going to be enough. So for that, in that case, we are going to add, let's say, one extra subdivision. So again, to put it in perspective, for example, we cannot do this kind of opening on this level of topology, simply because we do not have this level of edges. Because what happens is we cannot simply come here and add edges like this because what happens in that case is that we are actually losing the structure. You're gonna notice here the curvature is a bit different, and also the highlights are looking very, very bad in comparison to this one. So this one is obviously much cleaner. So in that case, we are basically adding more topology so that that topology can also hold the future details. But then again, how do we know that the topology that we added again is enough for, let's say, something further? So this is also now going to require sort of like a little bit of planning, because let's say that we want to have even smaller detail here, but with a sharper corner on this area as well. In that case, again, we come to this kind of like planning, because they're going to be kind of like the rule of thumb, where smaller the detail, more topology you're going to need. So in that case, that means that probably we're going to do one more extra subdivision, let's say, and we can do, for example, I don't know, from here till here. We can do one opening. And then from that opening, we now have, let's say, more topology to create, let's say, I don't know, this sort of detail. And let me actually just do a small offset here and delete this part. And now this is actually holding all these details in place. But again, what if now we want to have even more sharper corner, because now there's again difference between the corners. So again, same rule applies. Let me just undo this real quick. Same rule applies. We're going to smooth it even further, and then you're going to have very, very dense geometry that will allow you to have very, very, let's say, tiny details with a very, very sharp corners and very stable structure. So you can notice the difference in sharpness is very, very visible, and at the same time we're still maintaining the integrity of our object. And also what this allows us is to go even, let's say, further. So if we want to, we will also, let's say, do it like this, and then we can also redirect if we want to these edges at the bottom, if let's say we want to have even sharper edge. So just as a comparison between the two. And basically this is going to be kind of like when do we use it and how do we know when to subdivide. So it's basically going to be dependent on a couple of factors, and those are, do you want to maintain the original shape of your object, or do you want to have more like a smooth preview version of that object with more geometry? And how much geometry you're going to need depends on how far into the details you want to go. There's also another thing here worth mentioning, is that you can still, let's say, preserve here. Let's say that you don't want to have a sharp corner, but you need a lot of details. In that case, you will then subdivide this part right here, so smooth it out to preserve the curvature. So now we have more topology. Curvature is still preserved, and now we still get like opportunity to add all those tiny details while still having that relatively strong structure. So let's see another example where this is going to be useful. All right, so here we have a body of a motorbike, which I think is going to be a perfect example of what we're trying to demonstrate here, where let's say, again, the similar questions. How do we know when we need to subdivide this? So we need to answer the first question, and that question is, do we want to keep the edges as they are by simply adding new edges, let's say like this, and then keeping all these sharp edges where they are currently sharp. So if I then subdivide this and preview, then we get this as a result. So the sharp edges are maintained, and under the subdivision preview, we get those sharp edges back. However, if we actually prefer more of this kind of like subdivision preview view of the model itself, then this is kind of like the point where we are going to subdivide this to allow us to get more geometry from that original shape, and then that subdivision becomes actually our object. So now the difference between smooth preview and non-smooth preview, it's very, very minimal. So it's not that big of a difference as here and there. And we also get more topology to work with. So that's kind of like, again, more like a practical use of it. So here we can also answer one more question, and that is related, should you model with subdivision preview on or subdivision preview off? So really now it depends on the end result. So if we are aiming for this result, so if I'm now aiming to get very, very smooth curvature, in that case, probably what I will do is just, I will then model in this form. So every single point that I choose to move, I can then have a better kind of like understanding of where the highlights are, because simply this will become my new geometry. And I don't really care how does it look at this point right now, because that's not going to be my end goal. My end goal is going to be this, because once I smooth it out and subdivide it, this is what's becoming my geometry. And then this preview, or actually this initial state, it's not that relevant. So in this case, I can also model like this. So with smooth preview on, because I'm more in control of how my highlights are looking. So if we are, let's say, modeling like this, where the smooth preview matters more, then we can also model like that. But in this case, let's say if this is the view that matters the most, and if we want to catch all of these shapes, then probably you want to model with subdivision off. So that's kind of like the balance between the two ways. And here I'd like to share just one more tip, which is related to corners that show some kind of a pinching on a low level topology. So this is also what I see that it's happening often. That is, if you, let's say, subdivide this, so this state as it is, if you add more subdivision, that doesn't mean that you are going to get let's say either sharper or a cleaner corner. That just means that whatever you have here, adding more subdivision, will just inherit that state what you had previously. So in order to kind of like fix this, or in order to avoid this, you're simply going to need to smooth it before you add this detail on the inside. Because if you do it sooner, you're going to see what it happens, because you're going to end up with the same amount of topology that you have here, but your corner is not really going to be that much sharper. So if you now compare the two, you're going to see that basically you're getting sort of like same result, but without any pinching. So this one is now much cleaner, and the corners are basically looking exactly the same. So that is kind of like the difference between subdividing. So just make sure that if you're planning to do any kind of redirection, that you have enough topology for that, because if you do it too soon and smooth it out later, this problem is just going to kind of like inherit the state that was previously in. So I hope that this kind of like clarifies the situation a bit more. So yeah, this kind of covers it for this video. So thank you very much for watching, and I'm going to see you next time.